traffic between those two. Is that the...
No, like AT&T has a specific prefix, which is A.
Right.
And we're reaching to LDL through A. So when we do multi-home, AT&T has only some number of, like a range, only a range given by T.
Mm-hmm.
And when Verizon is using the same MC, Verizon is not losing any of that range.
Verizon is not losing any of its own range, you're saying? Yes, so in that example that we had set up, the multi-homing example, that particular one, Verizon was not using its own range for LBL. Both ways, you could do it both ways. It really depends on whether you want two paths coming in for one given prefix versus having two different prefixes. LBL could have also taken a prefix from Verizon. It's just a question of what you were trying to achieve with the multi-homing. And in this context where LBL is asking Verizon to kind of accept its route to A.B, that's part of their agreement. Part of what they're signing up for is you will advertise my prefix for me as a provider. So it's a done thing. Any other questions? Okay. Moving on, any questions before on how BGP is like and unlike distance vector? Okay, so now let's talk about how policy is actually implemented in this context. And so remember we said we have this usual iteration of I export certain routes and then I listen to what everyone's advertising and I import or I select certain routes. Let's actually look at that a little bit in action. Because policy, or everything we've been talking about, all these concerns about how money flows and so on, where it actually comes down to where it gets implemented is this question of what routes am I going to import or select and what routes am I going to export or advertise. So that's where, if you look at the implementation, that's where policy lives. Right, so let's look at this example here where I have these ASs and I have some destination prefix somewhere far out on the internet, 128.3. something. And I have two paths, both B and C, have the ability to reach that destination. So I have this green path and I have the blue path. Both of them are advertising these paths to A. Right? So A is listening, it hears two routes being advertised, two paths being advertised for the same prefix. It's going to pick one. Okay, that is our selection policy or route import step. And that's the step where we're going to inject some amount of policy. Okay. In picking that policy, when I pick which one of these I'm going to take, what I am effectively determining is how my traffic is going to leave my network when it goes to that destination. Okay. So here, let's say that A said, I actually like the green path. So I'm going to choose the green path. What that means is that when A is given traffic or it carries traffic for 128.3. something, it is going to send traffic to B. Okay, so keep that in your head because remember we said when we send traffic, we like to make or save money. So keep that in mind. But now again, when I take that, I've selected that green path, that was my import policy. I have another step of policy, which is now whom am I going to advertise that path to? And again, remember, when I advertise the path, what I'm telling the person I'm advertising it to is you can send me traffic. I will carry traffic for this destination. Right? And again, remember, we said I only want to carry if I'm going to make money by doing so. So in this case, let's say that A decided it didn't want to advertise it to Q, and it did want to advertise it to P. So again, this export step of deciding where you advertise your paths, that's another place where we put policy. Okay, so policy is imposed in how routes are imported and exported. I'm going to repeat this again, a few times because it's intuitive, but we trip on it multiple times. So import determines which path I'm going to use. Your import policy dictates how traffic leaves your network. Your export policy, which is the question of which paths do I advertise, it controls how traffic enters your network. One last time. Import policies, which paths should I use or which paths should I accept, determines where traffic goes. Okay? Because you're choosing the route. Export policy, which is the decision about which paths do I advertise and where do I advertise them, determines what traffic enters your network or what traffic you're going to carry. Any questions on this? I've found it's easy to get confused because the import and export is kind of the opposite direction of traffic flow. So when deciding what to import, you have to decide what you're effectively deciding is where your traffic will get sent. And then you think about how the money flows. Okay, so we're going to have these import and export policies, and we've talked so far about, you have these business relationships, and you have these principles around when you send traffic and receive traffic, where does the money flow, and so on. All of that understanding, or the language we use for that, comes from work done by Alishan Gao and Jen Rexford. They were both researchers at AT&T Labs when they did this work. So it was in the early days of the internet where all the ASs were kind of just setting up their networks in some ad hoc way, and nobody quite knew what they were doing. So they went out and actually surveyed a bunch of these ASs and tried to understand what was in the heads of these network operators, what they were doing informally. And what they distilled from that are what we call the Gao-Rexford rules. These are rules that capture common. So they're actually, despite the name, not rules. They're not, you don't have to follow them, but it's common practice in import and export policies. Okay. And basically, they codify or show us the pattern behind this routing follows money intuition that we've had. So far we've been saying routing follows money. It's all been very intuitive. The Gao-Rexford rules translate that intuition into import and export policies. They're also very useful because, we've been saying so far, I'm not sure it's reachable. Different ASs can choose different policies. The Gao-Rexford rules tell us if every AS on the internet follows these rules, we can start to reason more formally about things like convergence, about things like reachability, and so on. So it's the closest we have to a more formal, rigorous baseline for interdomain routing. Which doesn't mean that an AS cannot go do some crazy thing. They can, but at least this gives us a baseline that makes sense. And as far as we know, all ASs follow the Gao-Rexford rules. So with that, what is the Gao-Rexford rule? This is, again, repeating that intuition. This says when I hear routes being advertised to me, when I select them or when I import them, the rule I'm going to follow is I will always prefer a route that was advertised to me by a customer over a route advertised by a peer, and the peer over a route advertised by a provider. This directly follows the when you send traffic, you either try to make or save money. Right? If you're trying to make money, you would always like your customer route. If you're trying to save it, then you'd prefer peer over a provider. And only when you have no choice will you choose your provider. In practice, ASs will use additional rules. So, you might have, for example, many peers. Let's say you had no customers, but you had many peers whose route you could have picked. So typically what an AS will do is they will apply the Gao-Rexford rule. And they'll say, okay, I heard the path advertised from these 3 peers. And then they'll have additional policies for how to pick amongst those 3. And they'll do things like picking based on the performance of the path or, maximizing use of your network bandwidth and so on. And when we get to the details of BGP, we'll talk about how they implement those. But the Gao-Rexford rule is typically the first rule you apply. Similarly, Gao-Rexford on the export side. The question again here was now I have routes for certain that I've selected for certain prefixes. Where and whom do I export them to? And so remember here again, when I export a route, what it means is that I'm accepting to carry traffic to that destination. So what is the policy we're going to follow? So what the Gao-Rexford rule tells us is it comes down to this table. And the question we're going to look at again is I'm going to export that route, which means I'm going to be asked to carry traffic to that destination. And we said I only carry traffic if I get paid for it. How do you decide whether you get paid for it? Right? The way you decide whether you get paid for it is you look at who advertised that route to you. Because that's going to be when you carry traffic, you're going to carry traffic to the person that advertised the route to you. Okay, so let's look at what those options mean. Let's say that you're a router here, we're the one in the middle, and I have a provider A, a peer B, and 2 customers C and D. Okay. Now let's say I had a path that was advertised, a prefix that was advertised to me by a customer. So let's say in this case that C advertised a prefix to me. And now my decision as my export policy, and remember, I'm only going to carry if I get paid, is that I will, whom would I export this prefix to? example, so the question here is again, route being advertised by C to me. Should I export that route to D? Yes, right? Because I'm going to get paid. Actually, I'm going to get paid by both C and D, so great. Should I export that route to A? Think about that. I see some people saying yes, some people saying no. Yes, because let's say I took that route from C and I advertised it up to A. So when I get traffic coming back from A to C, I'm getting paid to carry that traffic. Right? C is paying me. It is true that I'm also paying A, but that is actually also the nature of being a provider. But the requirement that I will only carry traffic if I'm getting paid, that is being met. Should I advertise that prefix to B? Yeah. No? Oh, some. I got a shrug and a yes. Yeah. You would export to all of them because otherwise you have no guarantee that C is actually reachable by everyone on the internet. Because what if B was only connected to one, X here and is not connected to some other part of the internet? In fact, you definitely should because let's say that B has some customer X here, but above B, B's provider is is Y, let's say. B is never going to accept to take traffic from Y, send it to me, and go down to C. Because that's going to be, B would get charged, B would not get paid. So in fact, you can't rely on B to connect you to the rest of the internet. You have to advertise it to A. Good question. Yeah.
So aside from like the connectivity thing, if I advertise to A, is it because like there's a commission to get paid down the line if you advertise to someone?
You will definitely get paid. So if I advertise C's route to A, and A sends me traffic to C, I will definitely get paid for it by C. There's a question about, do I end up getting paid more by C than I pay A? And that's kind of a market dynamics thing. The assumption generally is you figured out how this makes sense for you in terms of how the net money ends up being. And that if you as an AS are paying A more than you're being paid by your customers, you've probably not set up your relationships very well. Yes. Yeah. And the typical context here is, think of this as Berkeley and then let's say a California AS and then AT&T. If this California AS said, I'm not advertising Berkeley's route to the rest of the internet, then Berkeley's in trouble, right? So what this means is if my prefix was advertised to me by a customer, I'm going to export it to everyone. And I'm fine doing that because my customer is paying me to carry that traffic. Everyone happy with this? What if that destination was advertised to you by a peer? So now let's say that B had advertised a destination prefix to me. And the question again is, whom should I export this route to? And again, when I export a route, that means I'm willing to carry traffic to that destination. Customers. What about if I had a route advertised to me by a provider? Also customers. Why? Right. So if my provider advertises a prefix to me, that means that I will carry traffic to that destination from C or D, which is fine. Right? And this is, in fact, exactly what we want. Let's say, Facebook was somewhere out there in the world. My customers want to be able to get to it. And they're going to pay me for it, so I'm fine with this setup. Any questions about this? Understanding this is key, so if you have any lingering questions about this. Going once? So I said that the GAO expert rules are nice because they give us a certain baseline that we can make certain statements about how internet routing works.